In 1896, a British archaeologist named William Matthew Flinders Petrie was excavating the mortuary temple of a relatively obscure pharaoh on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes when his workers uncovered, beneath thick layers of accumulated debris, wind-blown sand, and fallen masonry, a massive slab of polished black granite more than 3 meters tall, its surface covered in 28 lines of hieroglyphic text. The discovery took place in the hot, dusty, debris-filled ruins of a building that had been partially dismantled in antiquity, its stones robbed for use in other constructions, its courts filled with sand and rubble, its walls reduced to stumps and foundations. Petrie, one of the founding fathers of modern archaeology, a man whose methodical approach to excavation, whose insistence on the careful recording of every artifact and every stratigraphic layer, and whose tireless energy in the field had established him as the most important and most influential archaeologist of his generation, had been working in the mortuary temple for weeks, systematically clearing the debris that centuries of flooding, earthquake damage, and stone robbing had deposited in the temple's courts and chambers. The discovery of the granite slab was not unexpected. Petrie had been looking for inscriptions that would illuminate the reign of the pharaoh whose temple he was excavating, but the contents of the inscription would prove to be far more significant than anything Petrie had anticipated. The slab was not new. It had originally been carved by an earlier pharaoh, Amenhotep III, more than a century before the pharaoh whose temple Petrie was excavating had reused it, flipping the great stone over and inscribing his own text on the reverse face. The text on the back, the newer text, the text that the obscure pharaoh had commissioned, was a hymn of victory, a celebration of military triumph over the Libyans and the mysterious sea peoples who had threatened Egypt's western border in the 5th year of his reign. It was a standard piece of royal propaganda, the kind of boastful military inscription that archaeologists had found on dozens of similar monuments across the length and breadth of Egypt. But on the evening of that discovery, Petrie said something to his colleagues that turned out to be prophetic. He told them, "This stele will be better known in the world than anything else I have found." Petrie was not exaggerating, because buried in the 27th line of the inscription, in the final strophe of the hymn, almost as an afterthought, almost as a footnote to the main text, were 5 hieroglyphic signs that would ignite a firestorm of scholarly debate, transform the study of the ancient Near East, and establish this otherwise overlooked pharaoh as one of the most historically significant rulers of the 19th dynasty. The 5 signs spelled out a name that Petrie, with his encyclopedic knowledge of ancient Near Eastern history and his years of experience in the field, recognized immediately as one of the most significant discoveries in the history of Egyptology. The signs rendered a name that had never before appeared in any Egyptian text, a name that connected the world of the pharaohs to a people whose history had, until that electrifying moment of discovery in the dusty ruins of a mortuary temple in Upper Egypt, been known to the modern world only from a single source, a single ancient text, a single literary and theological tradition that scholars had debated for centuries. The name was Israel. And nothing in the history of archaeology, nothing in the study of the ancient Near East, and nothing in the scholarly conversation about the origins of one of the most consequential peoples in human history would ever be quite the same again. The pharaoh was Merneptah, the 13th son of Ramesses the Great, the 4th ruler of the 19th dynasty, a man who had waited, with extraordinary patience and remarkable endurance, more than 6 decades for a throne that his extraordinarily long-lived father had refused, by the sheer persistence of his biological existence, to vacate. The circumstance of Merneptah's accession was itself extraordinary, perhaps the most dramatic example in the history of the pharaonic state of the biological lottery that governed the Egyptian succession system. Ramesses II had lived for approximately 90 years, an almost unprecedented lifespan in the ancient world, and during those 9 decades, he had systematically exhausted the pool of potential heirs that his prodigious fecundity had produced. Prince after prince had been designated as the crown heir, had been groomed for the throne, had been given titles and responsibilities and expectations, and had died, one after another, decade after decade of disease, of injury, of the simple biological attrition that the ancient world inflicted on even the most privileged and the most carefully protected members of the royal household. By the time Ramesses finally died, only Merneptah remained, the 13th son, the survivor, the last man standing in a succession contest that had been decided not by political maneuvering or military force, but by the pitiless arithmetic of human mortality. Merneptah had ascended the throne at approximately the age of 60, an age at which most men in the ancient world were already dead, and he had reigned for approximately 10 years, from roughly 1213 to 1203 BC. His reign was brief, barely a decade, a sliver of time compared to his father's monumental 66 years on the throne. His building program was modest compared to his father's, and his military campaigns, though genuinely significant, lacked the theatrical grandeur of the Battle of Kadesh. By the conventional standards of pharaonic greatness, the standards of monumental scale, of reign longevity, of architectural achievement, of military theatrical self-promotion, Merneptah was a minor figure, a transitional ruler, a placeholder between the colossus of his father and the chaos that would eventually consume the late 19th dynasty. But here is the problem, and it is the problem that makes Merneptah's story not merely a chapter in the history of Egyptology, but a profound meditation on the relationship between memory and significance, between the monuments we build and the footnotes that outlast them. Merneptah erected his victory still to celebrate his own military triumph, the great victory over the Libyans that saved Egypt from invasion and that secured the western border for a generation. The Stele was meant to be about him, about the pharaoh, about the divine warrior, about the defender of Egypt. But the Stele is not remembered for any of that. The Stele is remembered for a footnote, 5 hieroglyphic signs in the 27th of 28 lines, a passing reference to a people that the pharaoh claimed to have defeated, and that the pharaoh regarded as a relatively minor and strategically insignificant entry in a routine catalogue of conquered enemies, a throwaway line in a 28-line victory hymn, 5 signs buried in a sea of military propaganda and theological self-congratulation. The monument that Merneptah built to celebrate his own glory has become, across the millennia, a monument to someone else's existence, a proof that a people called Israel existed in the ancient Near East at a time, and in a place that scholars had long debated. The Pharaoh's stele has been hijacked by history, and the hijacking is one of the great ironies of the ancient world. But the stele changed everything. The mention of Israel, the earliest known reference to the people of Israel outside the biblical texts, the only reference to Israel in any ancient Egyptian document, transformed Merneptah from a historical footnote, from an overlooked pharaoh in the long shadow of his far more famous father, from a transitional figure in the gradual decline of the Ramesside period, into a figure of central importance for the study of the ancient Near East and for the understanding of one of the most consequential peoples in the history of human civilization. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand who Merneptah was. Not merely the pharaoh of the Israel Stele, not merely the 13th son who inherited the throne by the default of his 12 older brothers' deaths, but the specific, complex, and historically consequential ruler who defended Egypt against the most dangerous military threat it had faced in generations, who suppressed a revolt in Palestine, who commissioned one of the most important artifacts in the history of archaeology, and who presided over the beginning of the end of the Egyptian New Kingdom, the long, slow, historically tragic twilight of the most powerful and most culturally accomplished state that the ancient world had ever produced, the twilight of a civilization that had endured for more than 1,000 years, a civilization that had built the pyramids, that had erected the great temples of Karnak and Luxor and Abu Simbel, that had produced the most elaborate and the most artistically accomplished funerary tradition in the history of the human species. And that was during the final years of Merneptah's brief but historically consequential reign, beginning to show the first unmistakable and deeply troubling signs of the terminal decline. And that was during Merneptah's reign, beginning to show the first unmistakable signs of the decline that would eventually bring it to its knees. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let us begin the journey into the remarkable life, the brief but historically consequential reign, and the enduring and deeply ironic legacy of the pharaoh whose footnote outlasted his headline, whose passing reference outlived his proudest boast, and whose casual, offhand mention of a seemingly conquered people became the single most important and most historically consequential line he ever wrote. To understand Merneptah, it is necessary first to understand the extraordinary circumstances of his accession, circumstances that are, in many ways, as remarkable and as historically instructive as anything that happened during his reign. The story of Merneptah's accession is, in many ways, as remarkable as anything that happened during his reign. A story of patience, of endurance, of the slow, inexorable, utterly pitiless, entirely random, biologically determined, medically inevitable, humanly uncontrollable, and cosmically indifferent grinding of biological fate that cleared the path, prince by prince, to the throne of the most powerful, the most institutionally sophisticated, and the most culturally productive state in the entire ancient world. The circumstances were extraordinary, and they deserve to be understood in full before the military and archaeological achievements of the reign can be properly appreciated. Merneptah was the 13th son of Ramesses II, the great builder pharaoh, the man who had reigned for 66 years, who had fathered more than 100 children, who had built more monuments than any other pharaoh in the history of the Egyptian state, and who had lived to the almost unimaginable age of approximately 90 years. The longevity of Ramesses II was both a blessing and a curse for the dynasty he had created. A blessing because it provided decades of stability and continuity, a curse because it meant that the pharaoh outlived the first 12 of his designated heirs, the 12 older brothers, 12 princes of the blood, 12 potential pharaohs, 12 men who had been born to rule and who had died before the throne could be theirs, whose deaths, from disease, from injury, from unknown causes, from the simple biological attrition that no amount of royal privilege or divine protection could prevent. One by one, decade after decade, over the course of 6 extraordinary decades, had cleared the path, prince by prince, coffin by coffin, funeral by funeral for the 13th son to ascend the throne. The most famous of Merneptah's older brothers was Kamwaset, a remarkable figure in his own right, a man who has been described by modern scholars as the first Egyptologist, a prince who devoted his life to the study and the preservation of the ancient monuments of earlier dynasties. Kamwaset had served as the high priest of Ptah at Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, and he had overseen the restoration and the relabeling of ancient monuments that had fallen into disrepair or whose original owners had been forgotten. The prince's antiquarian interests were unusual for a member of the royal family. They suggest a man of intellectual curiosity and scholarly temperament who was more interested in the past than in the present, more interested in the preservation of knowledge than in the exercise of power. Kamwaset's scholarly temperament and his devotion to the preservation of the ancient monuments made him one of the most unusual and most culturally significant figures of the Ramesside period. A prince who used his position not to accumulate political power or military glory, but to preserve and to honor the achievements of earlier generations, to ensure that the monuments of the past were maintained, and that the names of the pharaohs who had built them were remembered. His extraordinary antiquarian activities, which included the physical restoration of damaged and deteriorating pyramids, the reinscription of ancient monuments whose texts had become illegible, and the organization of the Apis bull burials at the Serapeum at Saqqara, have led modern scholars to describe him as the first Egyptologist, a title that captures his unique position in the history of Egyptian culture and his genuine contribution to the preservation of the historical record. Kamwaset died in the 55th year of Ramesses' reign, approximately 1224 BC, and his death left Merneptah as the senior surviving prince the heir apparent, the man who would finally inherit the throne that his father had occupied for more than half a century. Merneptah's mother was Queen Isetnofret, Ramesses' second principal wife, the woman who had succeeded the famous Nefertari as the most important woman in the Egyptian court. Merneptah's mother, Queen Isetnofret, was the second principal wife of Ramesses II, the woman who had risen to prominence after the death of the celebrated Queen Nefertari, and who had borne Ramesses several important children, including the scholar prince Kamwaset and Merneptah himself. The identity of Merneptah's mother is significant for several reasons, most importantly because it placed him within a specific faction of the royal family, the Isetnofret branch, which competed with the descendants of Nefertari for influence and position within the complex, frequently contentious, occasionally violent, personally risky, and sometimes genuinely dangerous politics of the Ramesside royal court. The dynastic politics of the late reign of Ramesses II are poorly understood. The sources are fragmentary, and the relationships between the various branches of the royal family are difficult to reconstruct. But it is clear that Merneptah's accession was not merely a matter of biological succession, but also a matter of political maneuvering, factional competition, and the careful negotiation of competing claims and competing interests. Merneptah had not spent his decades as a prince in idleness. The decades that Merneptah spent as a prince were not wasted. They were, in many ways, the most important decades of his life, the decades during which he acquired the experience, the knowledge, and the institutional relationships that would enable him to govern effectively when the throne finally became his. By the long-awaited 40th year of his father's extraordinary reign, when Merneptah was already approximately in his 40s, he held the title of Overseer of the Army, a position that placed him at the head of the Egyptian military establishment, and that gave him practical experience in the management of the empire's most important institution. The military experience was invaluable. It gave Merneptah a first-hand understanding of the threats that Egypt faced, the resources that were available to meet those threats, and the logistical and administrative challenges that the defense of a far-flung empire entailed. The transition from prince to pharaoh was, for Merneptah, less a transformation than a culmination. The final step in a decades-long process of preparation, the assumption of the supreme title that gave formal recognition to the authority that Merneptah had been exercising, in practice, if not in name, for years. When Merneptah finally ascended the throne, he was not a naive or inexperienced prince suddenly thrust into a position of unfamiliar responsibility. He was a seasoned military administrator, a man who had spent decades at the center of the Egyptian state and who understood, with the clarity of long experience, the challenges, the responsibilities, and the opportunities that the pharaonic office presented. He was, in many ways, the best prepared pharaoh in the history of the 19th dynasty, better prepared than his father, who had ascended the throne as a young man in his mid-20s with limited administrative experience, and better prepared than his grandfather Seti, who had served as co-regent for only a brief period before Ramesses I's death. Merneptah's extraordinary preparation for the throne was the product of necessity rather than deliberate design. The biological accident of his father's extraordinary longevity had given him decades of experience that no deliberate training program could have provided. But the preparation was no less valuable for being accidental, and the competence that Merneptah brought to the throne in 1213 BC was the direct result of the decades he had spent as a prince, an administrator, and a military commander in the service of his father's state. The Egypt that Merneptah inherited in approximately 1213 BC was, in many ways, a kingdom at its peak, the wealthiest, the most culturally productive, the most architecturally magnificent, and the most institutionally sophisticated state in the ancient world. The temples of Karnak and Luxor were the largest and most lavishly endowed religious institutions in existence. The army was the most experienced and the most technologically sophisticated military force in the region. The administrative apparatus, the network of scribes, officials, tax collectors, and provincial governors who managed the day-to-day business of governance, was the most developed bureaucratic system that the ancient world had produced. The diplomatic network, the system of ambassadors, messengers, and treaty relationships that connected Egypt to the other great powers of the Near East, was the most extensive and the most sophisticated in the region. Egypt was, in 1213 BC, at or very near the peak of its power and its institutional development, the culmination of more than 1,000 years of continuous civilizational growth, a peak from which the only possible direction, as the pharaohs of the late 19th and 20th dynasties would discover, was down. The international context in which Merneptah operated was itself a source of both stability and danger. The international system that the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty had created, the framework of mutual defense, diplomatic communication, and commercial exchange that had governed the relations between the two great empires for nearly half a century, was, by the time of Merneptah's accession, increasingly strained and increasingly fragile. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty, signed approximately 45 years earlier in the 21st year of Ramesses II's reign, had created a framework of diplomatic relations between the two great empires that had brought decades of peace to the Eastern Mediterranean. But the framework was showing signs of strain. The Hittite Empire was weakening, pressured by internal dynastic conflicts, by the growing power of the Assyrian Empire on its eastern frontier, and by the same migratory movements that would eventually bring the Sea Peoples to Egypt's borders. The network of vassal states that had served as buffers between the two empires was becoming increasingly unstable. The local rulers who had maintained their positions by playing Egypt against the Hittites were sensing that the balance of power was shifting and were recalculating their allegiances accordingly. The trade networks that had connected the great powers of the Eastern Mediterranean, the exchange of copper, tin, gold, grain, textiles, and luxury goods that had sustained the interconnected economies of the Late Bronze Age, were being disrupted by piracy, by political instability, and by the breakdown of the diplomatic and commercial relationships that had kept the trade flowing for centuries. Merneptah inherited this world, a world of surface stability and underlying fragility, a world in which the visible institutions were still strong, but the invisible foundations beneath them were steadily and dangerously weakening. A world that needed not a great builder or a great conqueror, but a competent, experienced, and strategically astute manager who could maintain the existing structures, address the emerging threats, and hold the system together for as long as possible. This was the challenge that Merneptah faced, and it was a challenge that he met with a competence and a determination that his brief reign and his relative historical obscurity have failed to adequately acknowledge. Ramesses's 66-year reign had been a period of extraordinary stability and architectural ambition. The temples at Abu Simbel, the hypostyle hall at Karnak, the Ramesseum, the city of Pi Ramesses, and hundreds of other monuments had been built or expanded, and the peace treaty with the Hittites had brought decades of diplomatic stability to the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Egyptian Empire had reached the geographic and institutional apex that it would maintain in gradually deteriorating form for the remainder of the New Kingdom period. But the very length and the very magnificence of Ramesses's reign had created a paradox that Merneptah would have to confront. The longer a great reign lasts, the more difficult the transition to the next reign becomes. Ramesses had been pharaoh for so long that the institutional memory and the administrative habits of the Egyptian state were thoroughly dominated by his singular and overwhelming presence. The officials who managed the government, the officers who commanded the army, the priests who served the temples, the scribes who recorded the business of the state, had all grown up and grown old under a single pharaoh, and the habits of governance that they had developed were shaped by the specific circumstances of Ramesses's reign rather than by the more general principles of pharaonic administration. The transition to a new pharaoh, even a pharaoh who was as experienced and as well prepared as Merneptah, required an institutional adjustment that was, in the best of circumstances, difficult, and that was, in the circumstances of the late 13th century BC, potentially dangerous. The geopolitical environment that Merneptah inherited was also changing in ways that the Egyptian state was only beginning to understand. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's principal rival and, since the peace treaty, its principal diplomatic partner, was weakening, undermined by internal dynastic conflicts and by the growing, militarily aggressive, diplomatically hostile, and increasingly threatening strategic pressure of the resurgent and expansionist Assyrian Empire on its vulnerable eastern frontier. The trade networks that connected the great powers of the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, the Hittites, Babylon, Assyria, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, were beginning to fray, disrupted by the piracy and the maritime raiding that the Sea Peoples represented. The vassal states of the Levant, the cities that Egypt had controlled, directly or indirectly, for centuries, were growing restive, sensing the weakening of Egyptian authority and calculating whether the moment had arrived to assert their independence. The world that Merneptah inherited was a world in transition, a world in which the old certainties were dissolving, the old structures were weakening, and the old familiar, seemingly permanent order was beginning to show the cracks, the fissures, and the structural weaknesses that would, within a generation, widen into the chasms of the Bronze Age collapse. But beneath the surface of the stability, the seeds of decline, seeds that had been planted during the long decades of Ramesses's extraordinary reign, seeds that had germinated beneath the surface of the stability and the magnificence, seeds that would, within a generation of Merneptah's death, flower into the catastrophic collapse that would bring the new kingdom to its end, were already present, already growing, already visible to anyone who knew where to look. The signs of decline were various and interconnected. The military establishment had grown complacent during the long decades of peace that followed for the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty, the treaty that had ended the warfare between the two great empires and that had created a framework of diplomatic stability that had lasted for more than half a century. The officer corps was aging, the training regimes had slackened, the garrisons in the Levant were undermanned and undersupplied, the fortifications along the western border, the chain of forts, watchtowers, and garrison posts that guarded the approaches to the Nile Delta from the Libyan tribal territories to the west, had been neglected, allowed to fall into disrepair, and in some cases abandoned entirely, as the military establishment redirected its diminishing resources to more immediately pressing needs. The border defences that had been constructed and maintained by the pharaohs of the 18th and early 19th dynasties, defences that had been designed to provide early warning of Libyan incursions and to channel invaders into kill zones where the Egyptian chariotry and infantry could destroy them, had been allowed to deteriorate to a point where they could no longer perform their intended function, and the intelligence networks that were supposed to provide early warning of hostile movements along the borders had become lax, unreliable, and dangerously compromised. The economic situation was also troubling. The decades of monumental building that had characterized Ramesses's reign had consumed enormous quantities of resources: stone, copper, gold, labor, administrative capacity, and the relentless demands of the building program had strained the Egyptian economy in ways that were not immediately visible, but that were, in the long term, deeply damaging. The maintenance of the vast network of temples, monuments, and administrative structures that Ramesses had built required ongoing expenditure. The temples needed priests, the priests needed wages, the wages needed agricultural surplus, and the agricultural surplus was finite, subject to the vagaries of the Nile flood and the efficiency of the irrigation system that distributed the water across the farmland. The combination of an aging military establishment, an overstretched economy, and an increasingly restless periphery created a set of conditions that would have challenged even the most capable and most energetic pharaoh. And Merneptah, for all his decades of experience, was ascending the throne at an age when his own physical capacities were already beginning to decline. Despite these challenges, Merneptah brought to the throne a set of qualities that the situation urgently required: practical military experience, institutional knowledge, administrative competence, and a clear-eyed understanding of the threats that Egypt faced and the resources that were available to meet them. The new pharaoh was not a visionary. He was not a builder of new cities or a signer of epochal peace treaties. He was a manager, a defender, a man whose virtues were the unglamorous but essential virtues of competence, decisiveness, and the willingness to act when action was required. The military establishment, the army, the chariotry, the garrison forces, the naval squadrons, the intelligence networks, and the logistical infrastructure that supported them had progressively and dangerously deteriorated during the final years of Ramesses's exceptionally long reign. An aging pharaoh, increasingly confined to his palace, had been unable to maintain the level of military readiness that the defense of the empire required. The Libyan tribes on Egypt's western border had been growing in strength and in confidence, testing the empire's defenses and probing for weaknesses. And the mysterious sea peoples, the coalition of maritime raiders from the Aegean, Anatolia, and the eastern Mediterranean, who would, within a generation, devastate the entire eastern Mediterranean world, were beginning to appear on the horizon, first as pirates and mercenaries, then as invaders. Merneptah moved the administrative centre of the Egyptian state from Ramesses, his father's great capital in the eastern Nile Delta, back to Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, where he constructed a royal palace adjacent to the great temple of Ptah. The move to Memphis was one of the first and most symbolically important decisions of Merneptah's reign, a decision that announced, in the language of architectural and administrative geography, the new pharaoh's priorities and his understanding of the challenges that lay ahead. The move was significant. It represented a deliberate, symbolically resonant, theologically significant, and politically meaningful return to the traditional and historically sanctified centre of Egyptian power, a reconnection with the deep, ancient, venerable, historically sanctified, culturally familiar, politically stabilizing, administratively functional, and socially cohesive institutional and theological traditions of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, and a statement that the new pharaoh intended to govern from a position of established authority rather than from the innovative but politically isolated position of his father's Delta capital. The palace that Merneptah built at Memphis has been partially excavated by archaeologists, revealing the remains of a substantial royal residence that included administrative offices, audience halls, residential quarters, and storage facilities. The palace was constructed adjacent to the Great Temple of Ptah, the largest and most important religious institution in Memphis, the temple that had served as the spiritual and administrative center of the city for millennia. The proximity of the palace to the temple reflected the close and mutually reinforcing relationship between the pharaonic institution and the Ptah priesthood that characterized Merneptah's reign. A relationship that was both political and personal, both institutional and devotional. The choice of Memphis also reflected Merneptah's deeply personal and theologically significant connection to the god Ptah, the creator god whose name formed part of the pharaoh's own name. Merneptah means beloved of Ptah, and whose temple at Memphis had been administered by Merneptah's beloved and scholarly brother Kamwaset for decades. The name Merneptah, beloved of Ptah, was not merely a conventional royal appellative, but a genuine expression of the pharaoh's deep, genuine, publicly expressed, architecturally manifested, and theologically consequential personal devotion to the great creator god, a devotion that shaped his policies, his building program, and his theological self-presentation throughout his reign. The relationship between Merneptah and Ptah was, in many ways, the defining theological relationship of the reign. A relationship that was expressed in the dream vision before the battle against the Libyans, in the construction of the palace at Memphis, and in the prominent position that Ptah occupied in the decorative program of the Israel Stele itself, where the god appears at the top of the monument, his figure dominating the scene and establishing the theological framework for the military narrative that follows. The defining crisis of Merneptah's reign came in his 5th year, approximately 1209 BC, when the most serious military threat that Egypt had faced in generations materialized on the empire's western border. The Libyan threat had been building for decades, a slow, steady pressure on Egypt's western frontier that the long reign of Ramesses II had failed to address with sufficient determination, and that the deterioration of Egypt's military readiness during the final years of the old pharaoh's reign, had allowed to grow from a minor annoyance into a major strategic danger. The Libu and the Meshwesh, the principal, the most politically organized, the most territorially expansive, the most demographically significant, the most culturally cohesive, the most economically ambitious, the most powerful, and the most militarily formidable Libyan tribal confederations, who dominated and controlled the vast, arid, and sparsely populated territory west of the fertile Nile Delta, had formed an alliance with groups of the Sea Peoples, the Sherdan, the Shekelesh, the Lukka, the Tursha, and the Akawasha, and had launched a carefully coordinated and comprehensively planned invasion of Egypt, pushing eastward across the western desert toward the delta and threatening the city of Memphis itself. The scale of the invasion was enormous. The ancient sources describe an army of tens of thousands, including the Libyan warriors, their Sea Peoples allies, their families, their livestock, and their household goods. The nature of the invasion was itself a new and alarming development. It represented a type of threat that the Egyptian state had not previously faced, and that the Egyptian military establishment was not well prepared to counter. Previous Libyan incursions had been raids, hit-and-run attacks by small bands of warriors who crossed the border, seized livestock and supplies, and withdrew before the Egyptian garrison forces could respond. The invasion of 1209 BC was fundamentally different. It was not a raid but a migration, not a temporary incursion but a permanent displacement, not a military operation with limited objectives, but a civilizational event with existential implications. This was not merely a military raid, it was a migration, a movement of entire peoples seeking to settle on the fertile lands of the Nile Delta, to take the agricultural wealth of Egypt for themselves, and to displace or subjugate the Egyptian population that occupied the land they coveted. The leader of the invasion was a Libyan chief named Merneptah, who had organized the coalition, negotiated the alliance with the Sea Peoples, and mobilized the military forces that would carry out the assault. The identity of the Sea Peoples, the coalition of maritime and land-based groups who joined the Libyan invasion, has been one of the most debated topics in the study of the ancient Near East. The Egyptian texts identify them by their tribal or ethnic names: the Sherdan, the Shekelesh, the Lukka, the Tursha, and the Akawasha, but the precise origin and the ethnic identity of these groups remain uncertain. Some scholars have identified the Sherdan with the people of Sardinia, the Shekelesh with the people of Sicily, the Lukka with the Lycians of southwestern Anatolia, and the Tursha with the Tyrrhenians of Italy. Other scholars have challenged these identifications, arguing that the Sea Peoples were more likely to have originated in the Aegean or the eastern Mediterranean coast, rather than in the western Mediterranean. The debate continues, and the identity of the Sea Peoples remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of ancient history. What is clear is that the Sea Peoples who joined the Libyan invasion were displaced populations, refugees from the political and military upheavals that were beginning to destabilize the eastern Mediterranean, peoples who had lost their homelands and who were seeking new territories in which to settle, fight, and rebuild. The threat was existential. If the Libyan Sea Peoples coalition succeeded in conquering the delta, the consequences for the Egyptian state would have been catastrophic. The delta was the breadbasket of Egypt, the most agriculturally productive region of the kingdom, the source of the grain that fed the population and funded the state. The strategic situation was made even more dangerous by the timing of the invasion. The attack came during the spring, the season when the agricultural cycle was at its most critical, when the crops were growing in the fields and the granaries were at their lowest light point before the harvest. A successful invasion during this season would have disrupted the agricultural cycle, destroyed the growing crops, captured or scattered the farming population, and created a food crisis that would have compounded the military crisis, and that would have made recovery virtually impossible. The attackers understood this. The timing of the invasion was not accidental, but deliberate, calculated to inflict maximum economic damage on the Egyptian state and to exploit the vulnerability of the agricultural calendar. The loss of the delta would have meant the loss of Egypt's economic foundation, the collapse of the administrative and military structures that depended on the delta's agricultural surplus, and the end of the Egyptian state as a functioning political and military entity. Merneptah understood the magnitude of the threat, understood it with the clarity and the realism of a man who had spent decades studying the military and strategic challenges that Egypt faced, who had served as the overseer of the army, who had participated in the planning and the execution of military operations, and who knew from first-hand experience the strengths and the weaknesses of the Egyptian military establishment. The pharaoh's response was swift, comprehensive, and strategically sound. He mobilized the Egyptian army with impressive speed and organizational efficiency. He reinforced the western garrisons with additional troops drawn from the provincial levies and the standing forces at Memphis and Thebes. He gathered intelligence about the size and the composition of the enemy force. He selected the battlefield, and he devised a battle plan that was designed to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of the coalition army and to maximize the effectiveness of the Egyptian military's greatest asset, its archers. The mobilization of the Egyptian army for the battle against the Libyans and the Sea Peoples was one of the most impressive, the most administratively complex, the most resource-intensive, and the most organizationally demanding logistical achievements of the entire late New Kingdom period. A demonstration of the Egyptian state's continuing and impressive capacity to organize, to equip, to supply, and to rapidly deploy a large military force on short notice, and to coordinate the movements of infantry, chariotry, and supply trains across the difficult terrain of the Western Delta. The army that Merneptah assembled included units from across the kingdom, garrison troops from the Delta fortresses, provincial levies from Upper Egypt, elite units from the capital, and specialist formations, including the archers, whose devastating effectiveness would prove to be the decisive factor in the coming battle. Merneptah understood this, and he responded with the decisiveness, the administrative efficiency, and the strategic competence that his decades of military experience had prepared him for. The ancient sources describe a remarkable scene on the eve of the battle. Merneptah, according to the inscriptions, received a vision from the god Ptah, the creator god of Memphis, the deity whose name the pharaoh bore, in which the god appeared to the pharaoh in a dream and assured him of victory. The dream vision, in which the god Ptah appeared to the aging pharaoh and promised him victory over the enemies who threatened his kingdom, was a conventional element of Egyptian military narrative, a conventional literary and theological device that established the divine authorization and the cosmic significance of the campaign, and that framed the coming battle as an act of cosmic significance, a struggle between the forces of order and the forces of chaos, in which the pharaoh served as the instrument of divine will. But the convention served a practical purpose. It established the legitimacy of the campaign, it bolstered the morale of the army, and it provided a theological framework for the interpretation of the battle's outcome. The battle itself, fought at a location that scholars have tentatively identified as somewhere west of the apex of the delta, probably near the city of Peraa, was a devastating Egyptian victory. Merneptah's battle plan was tactically sophisticated and strategically decisive. At dawn on a spring day in 1209 BC, the Libyan Sea Peoples coalition appeared on the battlefield, apparently expecting a conventional pitched battle in which the two armies would engage in close combat. Instead, Merneptah unleashed his archers, deploying them in massed formations that rained volleys of arrows on the advancing enemy, while his infantry and chariotry held their positions and refused to engage in the close combat that the Libyans were expecting. The tactical innovation of Merneptah's battle plan deserves particular emphasis. It represented a significant departure from the conventional Egyptian approach to warfare, which typically relied on the chariot charge as the decisive offensive weapon, and which sought a rapid, decisive engagement in which the pharaoh's chariotry would shatter the enemy's formation and drive them from the field. Merneptah's approach was different, more defensive, more patient, more reliant on missile weapons than on shock action, and more concerned with inflicting maximum casualties on the enemy than with the dramatic theatrical heroism that had characterized his father's approach to warfare at Kadesh. The shift in tactics may have reflected Merneptah's personal temperament, a man who had spent decades as a military administrator rather than a battlefield commander, a man who understood the mathematics of warfare rather than the poetry of it, a man who preferred the efficient destruction of the enemy to the glorious narrative of personal combat. Or it may have reflected the specific military circumstances of the battle, the overwhelming size and the heterogeneous composition of the enemy force, the terrain of the Western Delta, which favored defensive operations, the terrain of the battlefield, the relative strengths and weaknesses of the Egyptian and coalition forces. For 6 hours, an extraordinarily long time for an ancient battle, the Egyptian archers, deployed in massed formations, firing volley after coordinated volley, systematically and mercilessly massacred the advancing coalition forces, inflicting devastating casualties while suffering relatively few losses of their own. When the Libyan chief Merneptah finally fled the battlefield, the Egyptian chariotry and infantry surged forward and charged the demoralized, disorganized, badly wounded, and psychologically shattered remnants of the coalition army and routed them completely and utterly. The aftermath of the battle was, in its way, as significant as the battle itself. The defeated coalition forces, scattered across the western desert, pursued by Egyptian chariotry and infantry, who cut down the stragglers and captured the baggage trains and the livestock that the migrating peoples had brought with them. The Egyptian army collected trophies from the dead, hands, phalluses, and other body parts that were counted and recorded as evidence of the scale of the victory. The trophies were presented to the pharaoh in a formal ceremony that was depicted in reliefs at Karnak, and that served as visual evidence of the magnitude of the defeat inflicted on the invaders. Merneptah ordered the carving of 4 great commemorative texts to celebrate the victory. 4 separate inscriptions in 4 different locations, each one presenting the battle from a slightly different perspective, and each one emphasizing different aspects of the victory. The most important of these texts, the one that would become the most famous artifact of the reign and one of the most important documents in the history of archaeology, was the Victory Stele, the Israel Stele, which was erected in the first court of Merneptah's mortuary temple at Thebes. The other texts were carved on the walls of the Temple of Karnak and at other locations. A comprehensive, carefully coordinated, and geographically distributed propaganda campaign that ensured the great victory over the Libyans and the Sea Peoples would be formally recorded, publicly celebrated, and permanently preserved for posterity in the most durable medium available to the Egyptian state, carved stone. The captured military equipment, weapons, shields, chariots, bronze implements, and personal possessions, was carefully inventoried and deposited in the royal treasury, while the captured prisoners were distributed among the temples and the estates of the Egyptian elite as laborers and servants. The victory was crushing. The ancient texts record that the Libyans and their Sea Peoples allies lost nearly 9,400 soldiers killed on the battlefield. A staggering number that, if accurate, represents one of the highest casualty figures recorded for any battle in the ancient world. The Egyptians also captured enormous quantities of military equipment, livestock, and personal possessions. The material evidence of the migrating peoples who had hoped to settle on Egyptian land and who had brought their entire households, their families, their children, their elderly, their livestock, and their most precious personal possessions with them into the disastrous campaign. The scale of the captured material provides further evidence of the nature of the invasion. This was not a raiding party that had travelled light and fast, but a migrating population that had brought everything it owned, including women, children, elderly, cattle, goats, domestic goods, and agricultural implements. The invasion was a migration, and the material captured by the Egyptian army reveals the desperation and the determination of the peoples who participated in it. The body count was verified by the gruesome but bureaucratically meticulous Egyptian practice of collecting trophies from the dead. Severed hands and phalluses that were counted by the army scribes and that were presented to the pharaoh as evidence of the scale of the victory. The practice was standard in Egyptian military tradition. It had been used for centuries as a method of verifying casualty claims and preventing the inflation of body counts by soldiers seeking rewards for kills they had not made. The total count of enemy dead, nearly 9,400, was recorded with the meticulous precision that characterized the Egyptian bureaucratic tradition. The Libyan chief Merier escaped the battlefield but was subsequently captured and executed, or, according to some accounts, deposed and killed by his own people, who blamed him for the disastrous defeat. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The Libyan Sea People's invasion of Merneptah's 5th year was not an isolated event. It was an early episode in a much larger and much more destructive phenomenon that would devastate the entire Eastern Mediterranean world within the next generation. The Sea Peoples who had joined the Libyan invasion of Egypt were the advance guard, the scouts, the pioneers, the first wave of a much larger and much more destructive migration, a movement of displaced, desperate, and militarily formidable peoples who would, within 30 years, destroy the mighty and ancient Hittite Empire, sack and burn the prosperous trading cities of the Levantine coast, devastate the island kingdoms of Cyprus and Crete, and threaten to overwhelm the Egyptian state itself. The Battle of the Western Delta in 1209 BC was, in retrospect, the opening engagement of the catastrophe that modern scholars call the Bronze Age collapse, the most comprehensive, most geographically widespread, and most culturally devastating civilizational collapse in the entire history of the ancient world. A collapse that would destroy the interconnected network of great powers, trade routes, diplomatic relationships, and cultural exchanges that had sustained the Eastern Mediterranean civilization for centuries. And that would plunge the region into a dark age that lasted for several hundred years, a prolonged, deeply consequential, historically tragic, intellectually devastating, technologically regressive, commercially destructive, and archaeologically well-documented period of cultural regression during which literacy declined dramatically or disappeared entirely in many regions. Long-distance trade networks collapsed, urban centers were abandoned, and the accumulated knowledge and institutional sophistication of the Bronze Age civilizations was lost, forgotten, or reduced to fragments and memories that would take centuries to reassemble. The Battle of the Western Delta in 1209 BC was, in this context, not merely a military engagement. It was a civilizational defense, a last-stand effort by the most powerful surviving state in the ancient world to hold back the tide of displacement, migration, and destruction that was sweeping across the Eastern Mediterranean. Merneptah's victory in that battle, his decisive defeat of the Libyan Sea People's coalition, bought Egypt approximately a generation of additional security, a generation during which the Egyptian state continued to function, the temples continued to operate, the administrative structures continued to provide governance, and the civilization that the pharaohs had built continued to exist. The reprieve was temporary. Within a generation, Ramesses III would face an even larger and more dangerous invasion by the Sea Peoples, and the cumulative effect of decades of external pressure, internal decline, and institutional deterioration would eventually bring the new kingdom to its end. But the reprieve was real, and it was purchased, at the cost of nearly 9,400 enemy dead, at the cost of a military mobilization that strained the resources of an already overstretched state, at the cost of the personal courage and the strategic vision of a pharaoh who was already old when he took the throne and who was defending a civilization that he knew, at some level, was already beginning to fail. By Merneptah's competence, his decisiveness, his administrative efficiency, and his willingness to defend the civilization he had inherited from his father and his grandfather, and the long, illustrious, and historically unbroken line of pharaohs who had built, defended, expanded, and maintained the Egyptian state over the course of more than a full millennium. The significance of the battle cannot be overstated. If Merneptah had lost, if the Libyan Sea People's coalition had overrun the Delta, if the Egyptian army had been defeated, if the administrative and military structures of the Egyptian state had collapsed under the weight of the invasion, the consequences would have been catastrophic, not merely for Egypt, but for the entire Eastern Mediterranean world. Egypt was the anchor of the late Bronze Age civilization. The wealthiest, the most institutionally sophisticated, and the most militarily powerful state in the region. Egypt's collapse would have removed the last great power standing between the migrating peoples and the complete and catastrophic dissolution of the complex, interconnected, culturally rich, technologically sophisticated, diplomatically networked, commercially vibrant, artistically productive, religiously diverse, linguistically varied, institutionally sophisticated, and economically interdependent civilization that the great Bronze Age empires had painstakingly built over the course of centuries. The Battle of the Western Delta was, in this sense, one of the most historically consequential, most strategically decisive, and most civilizationally significant military engagements in the entire history of the ancient world. A battle that preserved the Egyptian state for another century, and that delayed, though it could not prevent, the civilizational catastrophe that was already gathering on the horizon, a collapse that destroyed the interconnected system of great powers, trade networks, and diplomatic relationships that had sustained the Eastern Mediterranean civilization for centuries. And it gets worse. Merneptah did not merely face the Libyan Sea People's threat on his western border, he also faced challenges in the Levant, the strategically vital corridor of territory to the east that connected Egypt to the trade routes of Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Early in his reign, Merneptah's troops had to suppress a revolt in Palestine, a revolt by the cities of Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanoam, cities that had been vassals of Egypt for centuries, that had paid tribute to the pharaoh, and had acknowledged his sovereignty over the Levantine corridor, but that had taken advantage of the political uncertainty, the administrative disruption, and the perceived military weakness created by the difficult transition from the long-reigning and recently deceased Ramesses to the newly and uncertainly ascended Merneptah to assert their independence and to challenge Egyptian authority. The Canaanite revolt was suppressed by Egyptian forces that were dispatched from the garrisons in the Levant, forces that besieged and captured the rebellious cities, punished the leaders of the revolt, and reimposed the system of tribute and vassal obligations that had governed the relationship between Egypt and the Canaanite city-states for centuries. The Canaanite campaign is one of the less well-documented military operations of Merneptah's reign. The available sources are limited, and the precise details of the campaign are difficult to reconstruct with any degree of scholarly confidence. The campaign was depicted in battle reliefs at Karnak, reliefs that were originally attributed to Ramesses II, but that scholars have since reassigned to Merneptah on the basis of stylistic and contextual analysis. The suppression of the revolt was successful, the cities were subdued, Egyptian control was forcefully reasserted, the rebellious leaders were punished, and the flow of tribute was resumed. But the revolt itself was a symptom of a much deeper and much more intractable problem. The gradual weakening of Egyptian hegemony in the Levant, the slow erosion of the centuries-old, laboriously and painstakingly constructed, carefully balanced, diplomatically maintained, periodically renegotiated, administratively managed, economically consequential, commercially important, and militarily enforced system of vassal states, tributary relationships, and dependent client kingdoms that Egypt had carefully maintained and periodically enforced for centuries, and the growing confidence, the increasing restiveness, and the mounting ambitions of local populations who sensed, correctly, that the great empire was no longer as strong, as attentive, or as willing to enforce its authority, or as attentive as it had once been. The 4 commemorative texts that Merneptah ordered, carved to celebrate the Libyan victory, were not merely records of military achievement. They were political statements, assertions of the new pharaoh's legitimacy and competence, demonstrations that the 13th son of Ramesses the Great was capable of defending the kingdom that his father had built, and that the dynasty's hold on power remained firm despite the uncertainties of the succession. The texts were inscribed at multiple locations to ensure maximum visibility and maximum impact: at Karnak, the religious center of the state; at Heliopolis, the ancient center of solar theology; and at Thebes, where the mortuary temple that Merneptah constructed would house the most famous of the four texts, the great victory stele that the world would come to know as the Israel stele. The mortuary temple itself, located between the Ramesseum and the Colossi of Memnon on the west bank at Thebes, was a significant building project, though it was modest in comparison with the vast construction programs of his father and grandfather. The temple reused building materials from the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III, a practice that was common in the late New Kingdom when the resources available for new construction were diminishing and the recycling of existing stone was both economically necessary and symbolically appropriate. The reuse of Amenhotep's materials, including the great granite stele on which the Israel stele was inscribed, created a physical connection between Merneptah's temple and one of the greatest pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, a connection that enhanced Merneptah's own claims to legitimacy, and that associated his reign with the golden age of Egyptian civilization that Amenhotep III had represented. It was in the context of these military campaigns, the great victory over the Libyans in the west, and the suppression of the revolt in the east, that Merneptah commissioned the monument that would make him famous, the Victory Stele, the artifact that Flinders Petrie would discover 3,100 years later in the ruins of Merneptah's mortuary temple at Thebes, and that the world would come to know with a mixture of scholarly excitement and theological fascination as the Israel Stele, the Victory Stele of Merneptah, the document that contains, in its 28 lines of hieroglyphic text, the earliest known reference to the people of Israel outside the biblical tradition, the only reference to Israel in any Egyptian document, and one of the most consequential and most intellectually transformative archaeological discoveries of the entire 19th century. The stele itself is a remarkable object, a massive slab of black granite, more than 3 meters tall and approximately 1.5 meters wide, originally carved by the pharaoh Amenhotep III of the 18th dynasty and reused by Merneptah, who inscribed his own text on the reverse face. The reuse of an earlier pharaoh's monument was a common practice in ancient Egypt. Stone was expensive, transportation was difficult, and a pre-existing granite slab that was already in place at a temple site was a convenient and cost-effective surface for a new inscription. The original text of Amenhotep III, carved on the front face of the stele, is itself a significant document, celebrating Amenhotep's building achievements and his devotion to the gods. The juxtaposition of the two texts, the 18th dynasty celebration of building and the 19th dynasty celebration of military victory, creates an unintentional dialogue between two eras, two pharaohs, and two conceptions of pharaonic greatness that spans more than a century of Egyptian history. But the reuse of Amenhotep's monument by Merneptah also had a symbolic dimension. By inscribing his own text on the back of a monument commissioned by one of the greatest pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, Merneptah was associating himself with the legacy of the earlier ruler and was asserting his own claim to pharaonic authority and military prestige. The physical condition of the stele, when Petrie discovered it, was remarkably good. The granite had protected the inscription from the worst effects of weathering, and the hieroglyphic signs were clearly legible despite more than 3 millennia of exposure to the elements and the destructive effects of the flooding that had periodically inundated the temple's courts. Petrie recognized immediately that the stele was a document of major historical importance, a recognition that was confirmed with dramatic and far-reaching consequences when the full text was translated by Petrie's colleague, the distinguished German Egyptologist Wilhelm Spiegelberg, and the momentous and historically transformative reference to Israel was identified. The translation process itself was significant. Spiegelberg, a distinguished German Egyptologist who was working with Petrie at Thebes, read the text and recognized the significance of the Israel reference immediately. Petrie later recalled the moment of recognition, the moment when the hieroglyphic signs were read aloud in the lamplight of the excavation camp and their extraordinary meaning was understood, as one of the defining moments of his career. The discovery confirmed Petrie's instinct that the Stele was a document of the first importance, and the subsequent scholarly and public response to the discovery justified his confidence many times over. The text of the Stele is a hymn of 28 lines, composed in a literary style that was conventional for Egyptian royal inscriptions of the late New Kingdom. The hymn celebrates Merneptah's military victories, primarily the great victory over the Libyans and the Sea Peoples in his 5th year, which occupies the bulk of the text. The top portion of the Stele features a depiction of the god Ptah, the creator god of Memphis and the divine patron of Merneptah, while the inscriptions below narrate the pharaoh's military conquests and his hard-won victories in language that is characteristic of the Egyptian military, literary and propagandistic tradition. Language that combines factual military reporting with theological interpretation, that presents the pharaoh simultaneously as a mortal human commander leading earthly armies and as a divine agent executing the will of the gods, and that frames the military campaign as an episode in the eternal cosmic struggle between order and chaos, formulaic, bombastic, and designed to present the pharaoh as a divine warrior whose victories were not merely military but cosmic, not merely political but theological. The final strophe of the hymn, the last few lines of the 28-line text, is where the Stele's true significance lies. In these lines, the text turns from the Libyan campaign to a brief catalogue of Merneptah's victories in the Levant, listing the peoples and the places that the pharaoh had subdued. The text reads, in translation, "The princes are prostrate, saying peace. Not one is raising his head among the 9 bows. Not one dares to challenge the might of Egypt, the power of its armies, or the divinely sanctioned authority of the pharaoh. Now that Tehinu is ruined, Hatti is pacified, plundered is Canaan with every evil, carried off is Ashkelon, seized is Gezer, Yanoam is made as that which does not exist. Israel is laid waste, and his seed is not. Kavru has become a widow because of Egypt. All lands together, they are pacified." The textual context in which the Israel reference appears is significant. The final strophe of the hymn follows a poetic structure that pairs geographic entities with ethnic entities, alternating between cities and peoples in a pattern that reflects the Egyptian scribe's understanding of the political geography of the Levant. The pairing of Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanoam, all identifiable city-states with known locations, with Israel, an entity identified as a people rather than a place, suggests that the Egyptians understood the Levant as a patchwork of both settled, city-based polities and non-urban, population-based groups, and that Israel belonged to the latter category. The implication is profound. In the late 13th century BC, the entity that the Egyptians called Israel was not yet a city-state, not yet a kingdom, not yet a geographically defined political unit with walls and temples and a palace, but a recognizable and militarily significant population group that inhabited the land of Canaan alongside the established city-states of the region. The line about Israel is laid waste and his seed is not, is the most discussed, most debated, and most historically significant line in any ancient Egyptian inscription. It is the earliest known reference to the people of Israel outside the biblical texts, the only mention of Israel in any Egyptian document ever discovered, one of only 4 references to Israel in the entire archaeological record of the ancient Near East, and one of the most important and most intensively studied inscriptions in the entire history of Near Eastern archaeology. It is the only reference to the people of Israel in any ancient Egyptian document, a uniqueness that has made the Stele one of the most intensively studied and most frequently cited artifacts in the entire history of Near Eastern archaeology, and it establishes, with the authority of a contemporary Egyptian source, that a people called Israel existed, as a recognizable, identifiable, militarily relevant, politically significant, culturally distinctive, ethnically coherent, demographically substantial, regionally established, and historically consequential entity in the land of Canaan in the late 13th century BC, that they were known to the Egyptians, that they were considered significant enough to be mentioned in a royal inscription, and that they were, at least in the pharaoh's boastful telling, among the peoples that Egypt had defeated and subdued. The significance of the Israel reference is amplified by a crucial philological detail, a detail that has been the subject of extensive scholarly analysis and that has profound implications for the understanding of the Israelites' identity and social organization in the late 13th century BC. In the hieroglyphic text, each of the place names and people names in the final strophe is accompanied by a determinative, a classifier sign that indicates the category to which the name belongs. The cities of Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanoam are each accompanied by the throw stick determinative and the sign for foreign land, indicating that they are geographically defined entities, city-states with specific territories. But the name Israel is accompanied by a different determinative, the throw stick, and the signs for foreign people, indicating that Israel is not a city-state, not a geographically defined territory, but a people, an ethnic group, a population that the Egyptians identified not by its territory but by its collective identity. The philological significance of this distinction cannot be overstated. It represents one of the most important, the most frequently cited, the most intensively analysed, and the most passionately debated pieces of evidence in the entire scholarly debate about the origins and the early history of the people of Israel, and it has been the subject of intense scholarly analysis for more than a century. The Egyptian scribes who composed the text of the Merneptah Stele were precise and deliberate in their use of determinatives. The system of classifier signs was not arbitrary, but followed well-established conventions that reflected the scribes' understanding of the categories to which different names and entities belonged. The fact that the scribes classified Israel as a people rather than a place tells us something that no other source from this period reveals. It tells us how the Egyptians perceived the entity that they called Israel, how they categorized it in relation to the other entities in the region, and what they understood about its nature and its organization. The determinative tells us something extraordinary. In 1209 BC, the Egyptians understood and categorized the entity they called Israel not as a geographically fixed place, but as a demographically defined people. A people who existed in the land of Canaan, who was significant enough to be mentioned alongside the major city-states of the region, but who did not yet possess the fixed territorial identity that would characterize them in later centuries. Flinders Petrie understood immediately the significance of what he had found. On the evening of the discovery, he predicted that the stele would become the most famous artifact of his career, and he was right. The news of the discovery made headlines in England and across Europe, generating a level of public interest and scholarly excitement that was unusual for an archaeological find, and that reflected the profound cultural and religious significance that the mention of Israel in an Egyptian text carried for the predominantly Christian and Jewish audience of late Victorian England. The discovery arrived at a moment when the relationship between archaeology and biblical studies was a topic of intense public debate, a debate between those who believed that archaeological evidence would confirm the historical claims of the Bible, and those who believed that the archaeological record told a different and more complex story than the biblical narrative suggested. The Israel Stele provided ammunition for both sides of the debate. It confirmed the existence of a people called Israel, but it did not confirm the specific narratives of the biblical text, and it became almost immediately one of the most cited and most contested pieces of evidence in the ongoing conversation between archaeology and religion. The mention of Israel in an Egyptian text, a text that could be dated with reasonable precision to the late 13th century BC, provided the first and, as of the present day, the only known external, independently verifiable, precisely chronologically datable, archaeologically authenticated, scholarly consensus supported, historically significant, academically transformative, methodologically indispensable, and non-biblical confirmation that the people of Israel had existed in the ancient Near East at approximately the time and in approximately the place that the biblical tradition described. The impact of the discovery on the scholarly world was immediate and profound. Newspapers in England and across Europe reported the find as a sensational archaeological breakthrough, a discovery that provided, for the first time, external, non-biblical confirmation of the existence of the people of Israel in the ancient Near East. The discovery energized the field of biblical archaeology, the discipline that seeks to use archaeological evidence to illuminate, to test, and to contextualize the narratives of the Hebrew Bible. And it established the Merneptah Stele as one of the foundational texts of the discipline, a document that every serious student of biblical archaeology must engage with, and that every serious study of the early history of Israel must address. The discovery did not confirm the details of the biblical narrative. It said nothing about Abraham, nothing about Moses, nothing about the Exodus, nothing about the conquest of Canaan, but it confirmed, with the authority of a contemporary Egyptian source, written within living memory of the events it described, carved in stone by the scribes of the most powerful and the most bureaucratically sophisticated state in the ancient world, the fundamental historicity of the existence of a people called Israel in the land of Canaan in the late Bronze Age. The confirmation was limited. The Stele tells us nothing about the size of the Israelite population, nothing about their social organization, nothing about their religious practices, nothing about the specific events that the biblical narrative describes. But the confirmation was sufficient to establish a crucial historical fact: that the people of Israel were not merely a literary creation of later centuries, not merely a theological invention of the biblical authors, writing centuries after the events they described, not merely a theological invention of the biblical authors, but a real, historically attested population that existed in the land of Canaan in the late 13th century BC, and that was known to the Egyptians, who regarded them as one of the significant peoples of the region. The implications of this confirmation have been debated by scholars for more than a century, and the debate has produced one of the richest and most productive scholarly conversations in the history of Near Eastern studies. The Stele's reference to Israel has been used by maximalists, scholars who accept the broad historicity of the biblical narrative, as evidence that the Israelites were already established in Canaan by the late 13th century BC, consistent with the biblical account of the conquest and settlement of the land. The same reference has been used by minimalists, scholars who are skeptical of the historicity of the biblical narrative, as evidence that the Israelites were, in this period, still a relatively minor and non-urban population group, not yet the powerful kingdom described in the biblical books of Samuel and Kings, and that the biblical narrative of the conquest is a later literary construction that does not accurately reflect the historical process by which the Israelites came to dominate the land of Canaan, and to establish the kingdom that the biblical texts describe. The debate between maximalists and minimalists has been one of the most intellectually vigorous and most publicly visible debates in modern archaeology, a debate that has engaged not only professional scholars, but also the broader public, including religious communities, educational institutions, and political movements that have invested deep personal, theological, and political meaning in the historical claims, the geographical references, and the narrative frameworks of the biblical text. The Israel Stele sits at the center of this debate, a silent but eloquent witness, a slab of black granite that contains, in its carefully carved hieroglyphic text, the evidence that both sides of the debate cite in support of their positions, and that neither side of the debate has been able to interpret definitively or to claim as exclusive evidence for its own position. The Stele is, in this sense, a mirror, a surface that reflects back to the interpreter the assumptions, the methods, and the intellectual commitments that the interpreter brings to the text. Maximalists see in the Stele evidence of a people already established in the land, already significant enough to be mentioned alongside the great city-states of the region, already recognizable as the ancestors of the later kingdom of Israel. Minimalists see in the same text evidence of a minor, non-urban, and politically insignificant population group whose mention in the Stele is a footnote rather than a headline, and whose later prominence was the product of centuries of development that the Stele cannot predict and does not describe. The Stele's importance extends beyond the Israel reference. It is also a crucial document for the study of the Sea Peoples phenomenon, for the understanding of Libyan-Egyptian relations, and for the reconstruction of the political, military, and administrative history of the late 19th dynasty. The description of the Libyan Sea People's invasion provides detailed information about the composition of the coalition force, the tactics employed by both sides, the scale of the casualties, and the diplomatic and political consequences of the battle. Information that is not available from any other source, and that had been invaluable for scholars studying the military history of the late Bronze Age. The Stele's account of the Canaanite campaign, though briefer and less detailed than the account of the Libyan War, provides important evidence for the political geography of the Levant in the late 13th century BC and for the nature of Egyptian authority in the region during the transition from Ramesses II to Merneptah. The Stele is, in short, a document of extraordinary historical richness, a text that abundantly rewards careful and sustained analysis, not merely for its justly famous Israel reference, but for the remarkable wealth of detailed information it provides about the political, military, diplomatic, and cultural conditions of the ancient Near East at a crucial, pivotal, and historically decisive moment in its long history. The endurance of the debate, the fact that more than a century of intensive scholarly analysis has not produced a consensus interpretation of the Israel reference, is itself significant. It tells us something about the limits of the evidence, about the difficulty of reconstructing the past from fragmentary and ambiguous sources, and about the role that contemporary concerns and contemporary values inevitably play in the interpretation of ancient texts. The Merneptah Stele is not merely an ancient document. It is a modern battleground, a text whose interpretation has been inevitably, inescapably, and sometimes problematically shaped by the religious, political, ideological, and scholarly commitments of the interpreters, as much as by the evidence itself in the land of Canaan in the late Bronze Age. And this confirmation, however limited, was a watershed moment in the history of biblical archaeology, and in the scholarly study of the relationship between the biblical texts and the independently recoverable archaeological record of the ancient Near East. The Stele's reference to Israel must also be understood in the broader context of the political geography of the late 13th century Levant. The list of conquered entities in the final strophe, Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, and Israel, provides a snapshot of the political landscape of Canaan at a specific historical moment, a landscape that included both established city-states with fixed territories and population groups without fixed territorial identities. The inclusion of Israel alongside the major city-states of the region suggests that the Israelites were, by this time, a significant and recognizable presence in Canaan, not a minor or insignificant group that the Egyptians could safely ignore, but a population that was important enough to be mentioned in a royal inscription alongside the most established political entities in the region. The question of what this significance entailed, whether Israel was a large population or a small one, whether it was militarily formidable or merely politically troublesome, whether it controlled specific territory or moved across the landscape as pastoral nomads, cannot be answered from the Stele alone. The text tells us that Israel existed and that it was known, but it tells us nothing about the specific characteristics, the organization, or the experiences of the people it names. The Stele tantalizingly refuses to answer the questions that modern scholars most urgently want answered. It tells us nothing about where Israel came from, whether they migrated into Canaan from outside, whether they emerged from within the Canaanite population itself, whether they descended from pastoralist groups that had always inhabited the hill country of central Canaan. It tells us nothing about what Israel believed, whether they were already monotheists, whether they worshipped the God who would later be known as Yahweh, whether their religious practices differed in any significant way from those of their Canaanite neighbors. It tells us nothing about how Israel was organized, whether they had leaders, whether they had laws, whether they had a sense of collective identity that extended beyond the tribal and the local. The gap between what the Stele tells us and what we desperately want to know is one of the most frustrating and most intellectually stimulating aspects of the document. The discovery of the Israel reference also raised a question that has been central to the scholarly debate ever since. What does the phrase, "Israel is laid waste and his seed is not," actually mean? The phrase has been interpreted in many different ways. Some scholars have read it as a claim of literal annihilation, a boast that Merneptah's army had destroyed the people of Israel completely and permanently. Other scholars have read it as a conventional hyperbolic formula, the kind of exaggerated military boasting that was standard in Egyptian royal inscriptions and that should not be taken literally. Still, other scholars have read seed not as a reference to descendants, but as a reference to grain or crops, interpreting the phrase as a claim that Egypt's army had destroyed Israel's agricultural capacity, their harvests, their ability to sustain themselves economically, rather than their population. The ambiguity of the phrase. An ambiguity that arises from the inherent limitations of translating ancient Egyptian poetic language into modern English, has fueled more than a century of scholarly debate and has made the Israel Stele one of the most intensively studied and most contentiously interpreted texts in the entire corpus of ancient Egyptian literature. The scholarly debate about the Israel Stele has continued for more than a century, and it shows no signs of abating. The questions that the Stele raises are among the most important, the most contentious, and the most intellectually stimulating in the entire study of the ancient Near East. Who were the Israel that Merneptah's inscription mentions? Were they the same people described in the biblical texts? What was their relationship to the Canaanite city-states that are mentioned alongside them? What does the people determinative tell us about their social organization? Were they pastoral nomads, settled farmers, or something in between? What does the phrase, "his seed is not," actually mean? Is it a claim of total annihilation, a formulaic boast, or something else entirely? The debate has been shaped by the competing interests and the competing methodologies of the different scholarly disciplines that engage with the Stele. Egyptologists approach the text primarily as an Egyptian document, a product of the Egyptian literary and propagandistic tradition that should be interpreted in the context of Egyptian royal inscriptions and Egyptian military rhetoric. Biblical scholars approach the text primarily as evidence for the early history of Israel, a document that can be used to test and to contextualize the narratives of the Hebrew Bible, and that provides a crucial chronological anchor for the reconstruction of Israelite history. Archaeologists approach the text in conjunction with the material evidence, the pottery, the architecture, the settlement patterns, and the other physical remains that have been recovered from late Bronze Age sites in the Levant, and that provide a material context for the textual claims of the Stele. The interaction between these three disciplines, Egyptology, biblical studies, and Near Eastern archaeology, has been extraordinarily productive but frequently contentious, marked by periods of intense scholarly debate and occasional outright hostility. The different methodologies, the different assumptions, and the different standards of evidence that the disciplines bring to the analysis have sometimes led to conflicting interpretations and heated scholarly exchanges. These questions have generated an enormous scholarly literature, hundreds of articles, dozens of books, and an ongoing debate that engages archaeologists, Egyptologists, biblical scholars, and ancient historians from around the world. The tomb that Merneptah built for himself in the Valley of the Kings, KV8, located in the main wadi of the valley, is itself a remarkable monument, though it has been overshadowed by the fame of the Israel Stele and by the more celebrated tombs of as father and grandfather. The construction of KV8 was a major undertaking, a project that employed the skilled artisans of the village of Deir el-Medina. The remarkable, historically well-documented, archaeologically well-studied, socially distinctive, and professionally organized community of specialized and highly skilled craftsmen who had been building, carving, and decorating the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings for generations over the course of Merneptah's approximately 10-year reign, and that produced one of the most impressive, if not the most artistically refined, tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb's design is simpler than the tombs of Merneptah's father and grandfather, reflecting both the shorter time available for construction and the changing aesthetic sensibilities of the late 19th dynasty. But the scale of the tomb is impressive, and the quality of the decoration, though damaged by centuries of flooding, retains traces of fine, bright paint that suggests the original appearance was of high quality. The tomb extends for approximately 160 meters from its entrance to the burial chamber, making it one of the longest tombs in the valley, and its decoration follows the standard Ramesses program, with scenes from the Book of Gates, the Amduat, and other funerary texts covering the walls of the corridors and chambers. The most remarkable feature of KV8 is the burial equipment, specifically the set of 4 nested sarcophagi that were designed to contain the pharaoh's mummy. The burial equipment of KV8 tells a story of ambition, engineering skill, and embarrassing miscalculation that provides a vivid and humanizing glimpse into the practical realities of tomb construction in the late New Kingdom. The 4 sarcophagi, 3 carved from massive blocks of pink and grey granite, and the 4th, innermost coffin carved from translucent alabaster, were so massive that the outermost coffin could not fit through the gates of the tomb, even though the tomb's gates were among the widest in the entire valley. The engineering miscalculation is one of the most revealing and most humanizing details in the entire archaeological record of the Valley of the Kings. A reminder that the ancient Egyptians, for all their extraordinary engineering skill and their millennia of experience in tomb construction, were fallible human beings who made mistakes, who failed to double-check their measurements, and who sometimes discovered, at the worst possible moment, that the pieces did not fit together as planned. The outermost sarcophagus lid measured approximately 2.13 meters in width. The tomb's gate openings averaged approximately 2.12 meters. The difference was approximately 1 centimeter, a single, fateful, and embarrassing centimeter, a margin of error so vanishingly and almost mockingly small that it seems almost cruel in its precision. A single centimeter separated the architect's plan from the architect's failure, and the discovery of the discrepancy, presumably at the moment when the labourers attempting to maneuver the massive granite coffin through the tomb's decorated gate openings found that it would not pass through, must have been a moment of acute professional embarrassment. The problem was a blunder, a miscalculation by the architects or the quarrymen who had designed the sarcophagi and the tomb without ensuring that the dimensions were compatible. The solution was drastic. The decorated gate jambs were hacked away, the massive sarcophagi were laboriously dragged through the widened openings by teams of workers, and the damaged gates were hastily rebuilt with plain sandstone blocks, a repair that left clearly visible and permanently embarrassing scars on the tomb's decorated walls, and that provides, 3,000 years later, a humanizing, almost comically deflating reminder that even the most sophisticated, the most experienced, and the most institutionally supported engineering tradition in the ancient world was capable of embarrassing mistakes. The mummy of Merneptah was not found in his tomb. Like the mummies of his father and grandfather, Merneptah's body was moved by the priests of the Third Intermediate Period to protect it from the tomb robbers who were systematically plundering the Valley of the Kings. The mummy was eventually discovered in 1898 by the French archaeologist Victor Loret in KV 35. The tomb of Amenhotep II, which had been used as a cache for royal mummies. The mummy had been placed, by mistake, in the coffin of another pharaoh, Seti I, the founder of the 20th dynasty, an error that speaks to the considerable haste, the administrative confusion, and the institutional disarray with which the priests of the Third Intermediate Period carried out their critical and historically consequential task of relocating the royal mummies from their original tombs to the caches where they would be hidden from the tomb robbers. The mix-up, a pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, placed in the coffin of a pharaoh of the 20th, suggests that the priests who moved the mummies were working quickly, under pressure, and without the careful attention to detail that the significance of their task demanded. The error was discovered and corrected by the archaeologists who examined the mummy, a mix-up that was discovered and corrected by the archaeologists who identified the mummy through the hieroglyphic inscriptions on its linen wrappings. The discovery of Merneptah's mummy in 1898 2 years after Petrie's discovery of the Israel Stele, was itself a significant archaeological event, though it attracted less public attention than the Stele. The mummy was found among a cache of royal mummies in the tomb of Amenhotep II, a cache that included the mummies of several other New Kingdom pharaohs who had been moved by the priests of the Third Intermediate Period to protect them from tomb robbers. The identification of the mummy was initially uncertain. It had been placed in the wrong coffin, the coffin of Seti I, a pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, but the hieroglyphic inscriptions on the linen wrappings confirmed, beyond reasonable scholarly doubt, that the body was indeed that of Merneptah, the 13th son of Ramesses the Great. The mummy of Merneptah shows a man who died at approximately 60 years of age. An old man by the standards of the ancient world, his body marked by the accumulated toll of decades of life. Modern medical analysis has revealed that the physical condition of Merneptah's mummy provides a poignant counterpoint to the heroic military narrative of the Israel Stele. The Stele presents the pharaoh as a divine warrior, a conqueror of nations, a defender of civilization, a man of power, strength, and divinely ordained authority. The mummy presents a different picture. The picture of a man who was old, who was in pain, who was wearing out, whose body was betraying him, even as his mind and his will remained sharp enough to manage the complex and demanding business of governing the most powerful state in the ancient world. Merneptah suffered from severe arthritis and atherosclerosis, conditions that would have caused him considerable and increasing pain, that would have progressively limited his physical mobility, that would have made the simple acts of walking, standing, and riding in a chariot increasingly difficult and increasingly agonizing in the final years of his reign. The pharaoh who had commanded the Egyptian army in the great battle against the Libyans and the Sea Peoples, who had ridden in his chariot and directed the deployment of his archers and his infantry, was, by the end of his reign, an old man in constant pain, his joints stiffened by arthritis, his arteries hardened and narrowed by the cardiovascular disease that would eventually kill him. The mummy was transferred, along with the mummies of 17 other kings and 4 queens, to the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo in April of 2021 as part of the celebrated Pharaoh's Golden Parade, the televised procession that carried the mummified bodies of ancient Egypt's most famous rulers through the streets of Cairo to their new home. The physical reality of Merneptah's body, the arthritis, the atherosclerosis, the evidence of an old man's accumulated suffering, stands in stark contrast to the heroic rhetoric of the Israel Stele, which presents the pharaoh as a divine warrior whose victories were acts of cosmic significance. The contrast is one of the most humanizing aspects of Merneptah's story, a reminder that behind every pharaonic inscription, behind every boastful claim of divine favor and military supremacy, was a human being, a man who suffered, who aged, who experienced the physical deterioration that time inflicts on every body, and who eventually died, leaving behind a kingdom that he had defended with competence and courage, but that he could not defend from the inevitable forces of institutional decline and civilizational entropy that were already, during his lifetime, beginning to erode the foundations of the world he had fought to preserve. Let that sink in. The pharaoh whose stele contains the earliest known reference to the people of Israel. The pharaoh whose inscription has been debated by scholars for more than a century, whose words have been passed and analysed and reinterpreted by generations of archaeologists, biblical scholars, and ancient historians, was a man who spent his entire adult life waiting for a throne that his father refused to vacate, who finally achieved supreme power at an age when most of his contemporaries were already dead, who reigned for a mere decade, 10 brief years, approximately 3,650 days of royal authority, a period of time that seems, in comparison with his father's majestic 66 years, almost insultingly, almost cruelly brief, as if the cosmos had granted Merneptah just enough time to prove his worth, and then had reclaimed the throne that his father had occupied for 2/3 of a century, and who died, worn out by age and disease, leaving behind a kingdom that was already beginning the long, irreversible decline that would eventually bring the new kingdom to its end. a decline that would accelerate dramatically under Merneptah's successors, who would face succession crises, civil wars, and increasingly desperate military challenges that the Egyptian state would prove less and less able to meet, that would eventually bring the new kingdom to its end. The brevity of Merneptah's reign, approximately 10 years, compared to his father's 66, is itself one of the most poignant aspects of his story. Merneptah had waited more than 6 decades for the throne, decades during which he had watched his older brothers die, one after another, had served his father as a military administrator and an overseer of the army, had witnessed the aging pharaoh's gradual decline, and had endured the interminable, seemingly endless wait for a succession that seemed, year after year, decade after decade, funeral after funeral, as though it would never come. When the succession finally came, when the old pharaoh died at approximately the age of 90 and the throne at last passed to his third son, Merneptah was already an old man himself, with perhaps a decade of active life remaining. The story of Merneptah's life, the decades of waiting, the brief burst of royal authority, the defense of the kingdom against existential threats, the slow decline of the body, the quiet death of an old man who had held together an empire that was already beginning to crumble, is, in many ways, a more humanly affecting story than the story of his father's reign. Ramesses II's story is a story of scale, of colossal monuments, of vast building programs, of dramatic battles and epic self-promotion. Merneptah's story is a story of duty, of a man who did what needed to be done quietly and competently, without the theatrical grandeur that characterized his father's approach to the pharaonic office. The difference between the two stories, between the father's story of creation and the son's story of preservation, illuminates a truth about the nature of leadership that extends far beyond the boundaries of ancient Egypt, that the quiet, unglamorous, publicly unrecognized, historically invisible, easily overlooked, frequently dismissed, rarely celebrated, almost never acknowledged, and all too easily taken for granted work of institutional maintenance is as important, as difficult, as demanding, and as historically consequential as the visible, celebrated, and historically remembered work of creation, that the defense of what exists is as valuable as the construction of what is new, and that the leaders who hold civilizations together during the dangerous, demanding, and historically decisive periods of crisis, transition, and decline, who manage the unglamorous work of institutional maintenance and border defense, who make the difficult decisions and the painful trade-offs that the preservation of an existing order requires, are, in many ways, as historically important as the leaders who build civilizations during periods of expansion and whose names are inscribed on monuments and celebrated in popular culture. The irony of Merneptah's place in history, the irony that he is remembered primarily for a reference to another people rather than for his own extraordinary achievements, is a reflection of a deeper truth about the nature of historical memory. We remember the builders, the pharaohs who erected the temples, the kings who founded the cities, the emperors who conquered the territories. We forget the defenders, the rulers who maintained the institutions, who repaired the damage, who held the borders, who managed the crises that threatened to destroy what others had built. The builders leave monuments, the defenders leave stability, and stability, by its nature, is invisible. We do not notice the absence of crisis. We do not celebrate the avoidance of catastrophe. We do not erect monuments to the disasters that did not happen. And so the defenders, the Merneptahs of history, the men and women who held the line while the monuments crumbled and the threats gathered, are forgotten, their contributions invisible, their names remembered only by specialists and scholars who understand, from their study of the sources, that the work of preservation is as difficult, as demanding, and as historically consequential as the work of creation. The contrast between the length of the wait and the brevity of the reign is one of the great ironies of Egyptian history, a reminder that the biological lottery of the ancient world, the unpredictable distribution of disease, of genetic susceptibility, of physical endurance, of the myriad factors that determine how long a human body can function, could be as consequential as any political revolution, any military campaign, any diplomatic negotiation, or any act of intentional human agency. The pharaonic succession system was designed to ensure continuity and stability, but it could not ensure longevity, and the extraordinary lifespan of Ramesses II created a succession scenario that the system's designers had never anticipated, had never planned for, and that no institutional mechanism, no legal provision, no theological formula, and no amount of administrative ingenuity could adequately address or satisfactorily resolve, and that the pharaonic succession system, for all its elaborate theological sophistication, its centuries of institutional refinement, and its complex ceremonial and legal complexity, was ultimately dependent on the unpredictable vagaries of human mortality. We have followed Merneptah from his birth as the 13th son of Ramesses the Great to his death, approximately a decade after ascending the throne, from the young prince who grew up in the shadow of the most prolific builder in human history, to the aging pharaoh who defeated the largest military threat that Egypt had faced in generations, and who commissioned the monument that contains the earliest known reference to the people of Israel. What does this story mean? Not for the narrow, technical, methodologically rigorous, and highly specialized academic discipline of Egyptology, not for the specialized and often contentious scholarly debate about the historicity of the biblical narrative, but for the human beings who hear this story and contemplate its meaning more than 32 centuries after the last hieroglyph was carved and the stele was set in place in the first court of Merneptah's mortuary temple. It means that history is not made only by the great and the famous, not only by the Ramesses and the Alexanders and the Caesars, whose names dominate the textbooks and the monuments and the popular imagination. History is also made by the overlooked, the underestimated, the men and women whose contributions are obscured by the shadow of their more famous predecessors and successors. The men and women who do not build colossi, who do not carve their names into cliff faces, who do not commission vast and expensive building programs or compose self-glorifying victory hymns, or erect colossal statues of themselves in temple courtyards, but who maintain the institutions, defend the borders, manage the crises, and hold the fabric of civilization together during the periods of stress and transition that are, inevitably, the most dangerous moments in the life of any state. Merneptah was one of these essential but often forgotten figures, a ruler whose contribution to the survival of the civilization he inherited was arguably greater than his father's contribution to its glorification, but whose name is known to the general public, if it is known at all, primarily because of a reference to another people in a text whose principal purpose was to celebrate his own military victories. The injustice of this relative obscurity, the obscurity of a man who saved a civilization while his father, who merely decorated it, is remembered as one of the greatest rulers in human history, is one of the small but deeply revealing ironies of historical memory. The irony that the man who saved Egypt from the most dangerous military threat it had faced in centuries is less remembered than the man who built the monument that tourists photograph, less celebrated than the father whose 66-year reign produced a legacy of stone and propaganda that has dominated the popular imagination of ancient Egypt for more than 3,000 years. Merneptah was one of these figures, a man whose genuine and historically consequential contribution to the survival of the Egyptian state and to the preservation of the civilization that the state had built was, in many ways, more important than his father's contribution to its glorification, but whose name is known primarily because of a reference to another people, a reference that the pharaoh himself regarded as a minor detail in a text whose principal purpose was to celebrate his own military victories, the men and women who inherit the achievements of their predecessors, and who are tasked with the unglamorous but essential work of maintaining what has been built, defending what has been won, and managing the slow, inevitable, and ultimately irreversible process of institutional decline that afflicts every empire, every dynasty, and every civilization that has ever existed. Merneptah was not a great builder. He did not build Abu Simbel. He did not construct a new capital city. He did not sign the first peace treaty in recorded history. His building program was modest. limited primarily to his mortuary temple at Thebes, his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, and additions to existing temples at Memphis and other sites. By the standards of his father's reign, Merneptah's architectural output was insignificant, a handful of buildings compared to the hundreds of monuments that Ramesses had built or claimed. But Merneptah did something that his father, for all his building and all his campaigning and all his monumental self-promotion, had never been called upon to do. He defended Egypt against an existential threat. The Libyan Sea People's invasion of 1209 BC was the most dangerous, the most comprehensively organized, the most strategically alarming, the most numerically overwhelming, the most geographically proximate, the most diplomatically complex, the most civilizationally consequential, and the most existentially threatening military challenge that Egypt had faced since the traumatic Hyksos invasion of the Second Intermediate Period, more than 4 centuries earlier. The invasion threatened the very survival of the Egyptian state, the loss of the delta, the destruction of the agricultural infrastructure, the displacement of the Egyptian population by the migrating Libyan and Sea Peoples tribes. Merneptah met this existential threat with the decisiveness, the strategic competence, the administrative efficiency, and the tactical ingenuity of a man who had spent decades preparing for the exercise of supreme military command, and he defeated it, decisively and completely, in a battle that inflicted devastating casualties on the invaders and that secured Egypt's western border for a generation. The victory was not merely military, it was civilizational. If Merneptah had failed, if the Libyans and the Sea Peoples had overrun the delta, if the Egyptian army had been defeated, if the administrative and military structures of the Egyptian state had collapsed under the weight of the invasion, the consequences would have been catastrophic, not merely for Egypt, but for the entire Eastern Mediterranean world. Egypt was the anchor of the late Bronze Age civilization, the wealthiest, the most institutionally sophisticated, and the most militarily powerful state in the region. The collapse of Egypt would have accelerated the broader civilizational collapse that was already beginning to unfold. The collapse that would, within the next generation, destroy the Hittite Empire, devastate the Levantine city-states, and bring the Bronze Age to its catastrophic end. The Israel Stele is, in this context, more than an archaeological artifact. It is a snapshot, a frozen moment in time, a single frame from a film that no camera existed to record, of a world on the edge of catastrophe, a world that was about to experience the most comprehensive and most destructive civilizational collapse that the ancient world had ever witnessed. A document that captures, in 28 lines of hieroglyphic text, the last moment of stability before the storm that would sweep away the interconnected civilization of the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. The Merneptah Stele is a document, perhaps the most revealing and the most historically significant document, of a world in transition, a world in which the old certainties of the late Bronze Age order were beginning to dissolve, in which the great empires that had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries were beginning to show the cracks and the fissures that would, within a generation, bring the entire system crashing down. The peoples mentioned in the Stele, the Libyans, the Sea Peoples, the Canaanite cities, the people of Israel, were all actors in a drama that was about to reach its climax, a drama whose outcome would reshape the political geography of the ancient Near East, and would create the conditions from which new peoples, new kingdoms, new languages, new religions, and new civilizations, including, most consequentially, the kingdom of Israel itself, would eventually emerge over the following centuries. The world that Merneptah defended, the world of the great Bronze Age empires, the world of the chariot armies and the diplomatic correspondence and the long-distance trade networks, was a world that was about to end. The Stele captures that world in its final moments of coherence. The last generation before the system that had sustained the Eastern Mediterranean civilization for centuries collapsed under the weight of the migrations, the invasions, the economic disruptions, and the institutional failures that modern scholars collectively term the Bronze Age collapse. The Stele is, in this sense, a farewell, a final document from a dying world, a last testament from a civilization that did not know it was dying, but that would, within a generation, be overwhelmed by the forces that Merneptah had temporarily held at bay. The Stele captures this world in transition with a precision and a detail that no other contemporary document matches. The Libyans, pushed eastward by pressures that the Egyptian texts do not fully explain, represent the migratory forces that were destabilizing the established order. The Sea Peoples, displaced from their homelands in the Aegean, Anatolia, and the eastern Mediterranean coast, represent the destructive potential of the populations that the Bronze Age system could no longer accommodate and could no longer control. The Canaanite cities, Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, represent the established order of the Levant, the system of city-states and vassal relationships that Egypt had maintained for centuries, and that was beginning to crumble under the weight of internal dissatisfaction and external pressure. And Israel, the people, the non-urban population group, the entity that the Egyptian scribes classified with the determinative for a people rather than a place, represents something new, something that the old categories of the late Bronze Age political order could not easily classify or contain, something that was emerging in the interstices of the established system, and that would, over the following centuries, develop into one of the most historically consequential civilizations in the ancient world. The Merneptah Stele does not tell us where Israel came from. It does not tell us how Israel organized itself. It does not tell us what Israel believed. It does not tell us anything about the specific events, the specific leaders, or the specific experiences that shaped the early history of the Israelite people. What it tells us is simpler and more fundamental. It tells us that Israel existed, that Israel was known, and that Israel was, in the judgment of the Egyptian state, significant enough to be mentioned, however briefly, however dismissively, in a royal inscription celebrating the military achievements of the Pharaoh. That is not nothing. That is in fact a great deal. In the world of the late Bronze Age, where the written record is fragmentary, where the archaeological evidence is ambiguous, and where the reconstruction of historical events depends on the painstaking analysis of incomplete and often contradictory sources, the simple confirmation that a people called Israel existed in the land of Canaan in the late 13th century BC is a finding of extraordinary importance, a fixed, firm, and independently verifiable point in a vast landscape of uncertainty, a historical anchor, a fixed, datable, and independently verifiable point of reference, to which the entire subsequent history of the Israelite people can be connected, and from which the reconstruction of that history can proceed. The story of Merneptah is, at its heart, a story about what matters and what endures, a story about the difference between the things that seem important at the time and the things that prove to be important across the centuries, between the headlines that dominate the moment and the footnotes that dominate history, between the monuments that the powerful build to celebrate their own achievements and the casual references that, unbeknownst to their authors, prove to be more historically significant than anything the authors intentionally created. Merneptah built his stele to celebrate himself, to glorify his own military achievements, and to proclaim his own divine authority. And the stele is remembered across the centuries primarily for someone else. He carved his 28-line hieroglyphic text to formally, publicly, and permanently proclaim the overwhelming and divinely sanctioned power of the Egyptian state. And the text is studied by scholars around the world primarily for what it reveals about another people's existence, another people's remarkable and historically enduring story, another people's historically significant, culturally consequential, theologically transformative, and civilizationally shaping place in the ancient world. He intended, with every fibre of his royal being, every ounce of his pharaonic authority, every available resource of the Egyptian state, and every established convention of the pharaonic literary and propagandistic tradition, a monument to his own personal glory. And he produced, inadvertently, unwittingly, and with supreme historical irony, a monument to the endurance of the very people he claimed to have destroyed. It is late. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo, the old museum in Tahrir Square, the museum that housed the stele for more than a century before the opening of newer facilities, is dark. the massive slab of black granite that Flinders Petrie pulled from the ruins of Merneptah's mortuary temple in 1896 sits in its gallery, its 28 lines of hieroglyphic text facing outward, its surface worn but legible, its message, the message of military victory, of divine favour, of pharaonic supremacy, of the power and the permanence of the Egyptian state, at a moment when that power was already beginning to wane and that permanence was already beginning to dissolve, of Egyptian supremacy over the peoples of the ancient Near East, still readable, still debatable, still capable of provoking the kind of scholarly argument that Petrie anticipated on the evening of its discovery, when the English archaeologist looked at the hieroglyphic text by lamplight in the lamplit ruins of a 3,000-year-old mortuary temple and recognized, with the instinct of a scholar who understood both the potential and the limitations of his discipline, that he had found something that would outlast his career, his generation, and his century, something that would be discussed and debated for as long as human beings continued to study the ancient world and to seek, in the fragmentary records of vanished civilizations, the evidence of the peoples and the events and the encounters that shaped the world we inhabit today, and to seek, in the fragmentary records of vanished civilizations, the evidence of the peoples and the events that shaped the world we inhabit, the stele and the mummy, the stone and the flesh, the public record and the private reality, together tell the story of Merneptah more completely and more honestly than either could tell it alone. The stele tells the story of the pharaoh's public achievements, the victory over the Libyans, the suppression of the Canaanite revolt, the assertion of Egyptian supremacy over the peoples of the ancient Near East. The mummy tells the story of the pharaoh's private suffering, the arthritis, the atherosclerosis, the physical deterioration that accompanied the exercise of supreme power during a period of mounting crisis and declining institutional capacity. Together, they present a portrait of a man who was both heroic and human, both powerful and vulnerable, both historically consequential and biologically mortal. A portrait that is, in many ways, more complete, more historically accurate, and more honestly drawn than the portrait of any other pharaoh in the entire Ramesside line. So here is the answer to the question we began with. Who was Merneptah, and why does his stele matter? He was a man who waited. He waited for more than 6 decades. Waited through the deaths of 12 older brothers, waited through the interminable final years of his father's extraordinary reign, waited for a throne that seemed, year after year, as though it would never be his. He waited, with a patience and an endurance that borders on the heroic, until he was approximately 60 years old, until he was already, by the standards of his time, an old man, and then he took the throne and he used it, with the efficiency and the competence and the strategic clarity of a man who understood, with the sharp and perhaps painful awareness of his own advancing age and his own mortality, that his advanced age must have imposed, that he did not have decades to waste, that every year mattered, that the challenges facing the Egyptian state were urgent, and that the window of opportunity for addressing them was short. He defended Egypt against the greatest military threat it had faced in more than 4 centuries. He defeated the largest, the most comprehensively organized, and the most existentially dangerous military invasion that the kingdom had faced in more than 4 centuries. He suppressed a revolt in Palestine. He maintained the diplomatic structures and the institutional framework that his father had built. He did what the critical historical moment demanded, what the immediate survival of the civilization urgently required, what his long decades of preparation had equipped him to do. Not with the theatrical grandeur of his father's Kadesh campaign, not with the monumental self-promotion of his father's building program, but with the quiet, competent, unglamorous effectiveness of a man who understood, perhaps better than any other pharaoh before or after him, that the defense of what exists is as important, as demanding, as heroic, and as historically consequential as the creation of what is new. And he inscribed a name on a stone, 5 hieroglyphic signs, buried in the 27th line of a 28-line text, almost an afterthought, almost a footnote, that would become one of the most important and most debated references in the entire history of archaeology. The name was Israel. The stele that bears this name is the earliest known external, non-biblical reference to the people who would eventually produce the Hebrew Bible, the foundational text of Western civilization, who would develop the concept of monotheism that would eventually transform the religious landscape of the Western world, and whose extraordinary, unbroken, resilient, endlessly adaptive, and humanly inspiring history would span many millennia, whose revolutionary and culturally transformative theological innovations would permanently and irreversibly transform the religious landscape of the Western world, whose cultural influence would extend to every continent and every civilization that the modern world encompasses, and whose endurance, through persecution, through exile, through diaspora, through the collapse of every empire that ever sought to dominate or destroy them, would become one of the most remarkable and most historically consequential stories of survival in the entire record of human civilization. The Pharaoh who inscribed the name of Israel on his victory stele in 1209 BC was celebrating a military victory, a victory that was real, that was significant, and that was genuinely consequential for the security of the Egyptian state. But the inscription has become, across the millennia, something far more than a record of military triumph. It has become a document of encounter, the moment when two civilizations, two peoples, two historical trajectories crossed paths and left a trace of that crossing in the stone. One of those civilizations, the civilization of the pharaohs, would eventually decline, collapse, and be forgotten for millennia before being rediscovered by modern archaeology. The other, the civilization of the people whose name appears in the 27th line of the Stele, would endure, would survive, would grow, and would eventually produce a cultural and theological legacy that would shape the world more profoundly than anything the pharaohs ever built. Merneptah did not know this. He could not have known this. He inscribed the name Israel on his victory stele as one item in a list of conquered peoples, a boast, a claim of military supremacy, a conventional assertion of pharaonic power over the lesser peoples of the world. The irony is immense, and it is an irony that would have been utterly incomprehensible to the pharaoh who inscribed the stele. Merneptah ruled the most powerful state in the ancient world. He commanded armies that could crush any enemy. He worshipped gods who had sustained the Egyptian civilization for more than a millennium. He inscribed the name of Israel as a defeated enemy, a conquered people, a vanquished foe whose destruction demonstrated the pharaoh's power and the gods' favor. And yet the people he dismissed as defeated would outlast everything he built, everything he defended, everything he believed in, and everything he represented. The pharaoh did not know, could not have known, could not have imagined, could not have conceived in his wildest fantasies or his most troubling dreams that the people he claimed to have defeated would outlast his dynasty, his kingdom, and his entire civilization. He did not know that his stele would become famous not for what it said about Egypt, but for what it said about Israel, that the monument he erected to celebrate his own victories would be remembered, primarily for a reference to a people whom the pharaoh regarded as insignificant, and whom history would prove to be anything but. The stele stands in its gallery. The granite is still black, still polished, still bearing the carved signs that a stonemason cut into its surface more than 32 centuries ago. The text still celebrates the victory over the Libyans. The text still names the cities of Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanoam. And the text still contains those 5 extraordinary signs, the name of a people whose story was just beginning at the moment when the pharaoh who inscribed them believed his own story would last forever. The pharaoh's story did not last forever. The dynasty that Merneptah served, the once mighty, once glorious, once culturally dominant, once architecturally prolific, once diplomatically influential, once militarily formidable, once seemingly invincible, and once seemingly eternal 19th dynasty, the illustrious and historically transformative dynasty of Ramesses, fell within a single generation of Merneptah's death, consumed by the bitter succession crises, the internal political conflicts, the increasingly violent and increasingly destructive factional rivalries that the pharaoh's brief but consequential reign had temporarily and precariously held in check. Merneptah's immediate successor, Seti II, faced a challenge from a rival claimant named Amenhotep, and the resulting conflict weakened the dynasty and accelerated the institutional decline and the political fragmentation that would eventually and irreversibly bring it to its end. The final pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, Siptah and the queen regnant Twosret, presided over a kingdom that was increasingly unstable, increasingly contested, and increasingly unable to maintain the military and administrative structures that had sustained the Egyptian state for centuries. The 20th dynasty that followed, the dynasty of Ramesses III and his successors, fought valiantly against the mounting threats, including a major invasion by the Sea Peoples in the 8th year of Ramesses III's reign that was even larger and more dangerous than the invasion that Merneptah had defeated. But the long-term trajectory of decline was, despite these heroic efforts, ultimately irreversible, and within approximately a century and a half of Merneptah's death, the new kingdom had irrevocably collapsed, and the pharaonic state had entered the long, painful, historically tragic period of fragmentation, political disunity, and eventual foreign domination known as the Third Intermediate Period. A period during which Egypt was divided between competing dynasties, during which Libyan chieftains established their own ruling houses in the delta, during which Nubian kings from the south conquered and briefly unified the country, and during which the civilization that had produced the pyramids, the temples, and the great pharaonic inscriptions entered the final phase of its 3,000-year existence. The new kingdom that he defended with such determination and such competence collapsed within approximately a century and a half, consumed by the cumulative effects of military pressure, administrative decline, economic contraction, and the slow but inexorable and ultimately irreversible erosion of the institutional structures that had sustained the Egyptian state for more than 1,000 years. The civilization that he represented, the civilization of the pharaohs, the civilization of the pyramids and the temples and the tombs and the hieroglyphic inscriptions, faded, declined, was conquered, was forgotten, and was rediscovered millennia later by the archaeologists and the scholars who have spent the last 2 centuries piecing together the fragments of a world that vanished from human memory more than 2,000 years ago. The people of the Stele, the 5 signs, the name, the brief footnote that the pharaoh casually inscribed almost as an afterthought in the 27th line of his victory hymn, endured. They endured through the Bronze Age collapse that destroyed the world Merneptah had defended. They endured through the centuries of Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman domination that followed. They endured through exile, through persecution, through diaspora, through millennia of displacement and suffering that the pharaoh who inscribed their name on his stele could never have imagined. They endured, and they endure still, their names spoken by billions of people around the world who have never heard of Merneptah, and who do not know that the earliest external reference to their existence was carved on a slab of black granite by a pharaoh who believed he had laid them waste and destroyed their seed forever. The granite stele stands in its museum gallery, silent and patient, bearing its message across the centuries. A message that was meant to celebrate the power of Egypt and the glory of the pharaoh, but that history has transformed into something far more profound. A testament to the impermanence of empires and the endurance of peoples, a reminder that the footnotes of history sometimes outlast the headlines, and that the name that a pharaoh carved as a boast can become, across the millennia, a monument to the survival, the endurance, and the historical persistence of the very people he claimed to have destroyed, and whose seed he confidently and publicly declared to be no more. A claim that history, with its characteristic, patient, and often devastatingly ironic sense of justice, has thoroughly, completely, permanently, and irrevocably refuted. The granite stands, the signs endure, the name persists, and the world that Merneptah knew, the world of the pharaohs, the world of the chariots and the temples and the hieroglyphic inscriptions, the world of the Nile and the desert and the valley of the kings, has passed away, its monuments standing in the sun, its mummies lying in museum cases, its inscriptions studied by scholars who have spent their careers learning to read a script that the last Egyptian scribe forgot how to write more than 15 centuries ago. The pharaoh's world is gone, irretrievably, irrevocably, comprehensively, permanently, and completely gone. Its temples in ruins, its cities buried beneath the silt of the Nile, its gods forgotten, its language dead for more than 15 centuries, its civilization reduced to beautifully preserved objects in museum cases and inscriptions on granite slabs. The pharaoh's world is gone, but the people of the Stele remain, and the irony, the quiet, persistent, historically extraordinary irony of a pharaoh's boast becoming another people's proof of existence, endures, carved in black granite, as clear and as powerful as it was. On the day the stonemason finished his work, and the 28th and final line of the hymn was complete, and the pharaohs supremely confident, brazenly triumphant, characteristically boastful, conventionally phrased, theologically framed, dynastically motivated, institutionally propagandistically calculated, and deeply and devastatingly historically ironic message to eternity, was sealed forever in polished black granite stone.